Hello students, my name is Deepa Shirsat and I'm working as an assistant professor in SNDT College of Arts, Churchgate campus. Today I'm here to discuss with you the topic from the paper Sociology of Indian Society. The name of the chapter is Subaltern Perspective and it constitutes the unit 4. Today we will discuss the subaltern perspective given by Ranjit Guha, David Hardiman, Jyotiba Phule and Dr. Ambedkar. Let us first discuss the meaning of the word subaltern. The word subaltern, as given in the Oxford Dictionary, stands for the general attribute of subordination, which is expressed in terms of a caste, class, age, gender, etc. It includes the characteristics of defiance and submission. Thus, in literal sense, it means view from below, that is, a view or understanding from the bottom of society or the flow of knowledge from below. Subaltern perspective is an important approach to the study of tribal, peasant and anti-caste movements in India. Let us see what Ranjit Guha has to say about the subaltern perspective. Ranjit Guha and his historian colleagues have developed a perspective known as subaltern historiography to study tribal and peasant movements. This approach highlights the role of the politics of the people as against elite politics played in Indian history. Thus, elite and people are viewed as binary domains to constitute a structural dichotomy. According to this approach, throughout Indian history, along with the elite politics, there has always existed another domain of Indian politics played not by the dominant sections of the indigenous society, but the subaltern classes and groups constituting the laborers and the intermediate strata in the town and country, that is, the people. Subaltern historiography treats people or subalternity as an autonomous domain that originates neither from elite politics nor depends on them. Therefore, the mobilization in the domain of elite politics is achieved vertically, and that in the subaltern politics is achieved horizontally. Guha, however, admits that subaltern domain is highly diverse in its social composition. Thus, the ideologies are not uniform in quality and density, and at times, such diversities lead to pursuit of sectional interests, economic divergence, as well as sectarian splits that tend to undermine the horizontal alliances in this domain. Therefore, Guha also clarifies that the two domains, that is, the elite politics and the politics of the masses, are not sealed off from each other but often overlapped, mainly because the elite domains always tried to mobilize and integrate them, but primarily to fight for elite objectives. However, the subaltern masses managed to break away from the elite control and put their characteristic stamp on campaigns initiated by the elite groups. The whole thrust of subaltern historiography is on reconstructing the other history, that is, history of people's politics and movements, and their attempts to make their own history. Guha has demonstrated how this other history could be constructed by offering a study of the peasant movements in colonial India, which is based on Marxist approach. Guha claims that the tribal and peasant movements in colonial India, though were unstructured in terms of organization, leadership, and ideology, they could not be branded as pre-political. The peasant and tribal communities rebelled against Sarkari, Sahukari, and Zamindari systems. For example, the uprising of Bhumij, the Santhal revolt of 1855, and the Indigo disturbances of 1859-62. These movements were attempts to destroy the then existing structure of power relationships and were no less political than the movements headed by liberal reformists under the banner of the Congress, such as the Tibhaga or Telangana struggles of the 20th century. But Guha accepts the fact that the 20th century movements of the peasantry and the tribals have been qualitatively different, and that the decisively more advanced at the level of consciousness, organization and ideological articulation. Guha's main objective in studying insurgencies of the colonial period is to show how patterns of subordination and insubordination have run on parallel tracks throughout the colonial history of India. There is an influence of Hobsbawm and George Rood's works on Guha's study. He has pointed out certain common forms and general ideas in the rebel's consciousness. These are negation, ambiguity, modality, solidarity, transmission, and territoriality. He draws his evidence to construct these forms from the various peasant and tribal movements of the 1793 to 1900 period, studied extensively by anthropologists, ethnographers, and historians. The first elementary form of peasant or tribal consciousness is negation, which implies formation of negative identity. The rebel's identity is not formed by his own qualities, but through negation of those who are superior. Such a negativity may not be fully developed consciously, but a first step toward consciousness building. Accompanied by an ability to discriminate friends from foes, negation often results in selective violence against the perceived enemies. In the Indian context, peasant and tribal rebels often rejected the homological relations in feudal society. All traditional forms of respect, dress, writing, literature, etc., as these were considered as symbols of the exclusive preserve of feudal monarchies and from which the subaltern were always excluded. The rebel's rejection of these structural rules was thus a negative assertion of his identity and consciousness. In the second form, Guha distinguished between crime and insurgency. To Guha, crime tends to be an individualistic or small group oriented, but secretive or conspirational action. In contrast, insurgency has a mass character which manifests publicly. Though violence is used both in crime and in insurgencies, there is an ambiguity in violence as an internal or integral part of insurgency. Modality, the next elementary aspect, is a logical extension of the public character of tribal or peasant insurgencies. Guha shows that the rebels often elect leaders and searched for an alternative source of authority. Here, primordial loyalties or sentiments of kinship, ethnic community ties, and co-residence often play a significant role. In the next form, that is solidarity, the peasant or tribal insurgent separates his identity from that of his enemies. Guha states that in most of the peasant uprising or ethnic movements before 1900, class solidarities and other solidarities, that is, those emerging from ethnic, religious, or caste ties, overlapped to a great extent. That is why Guha highlights the duplex character of insurgency, in which sometimes class and religion are intertwined and sometimes ethnicity and class identities get fused, as can be seen in Birsa Munda movement. In transmission, Guha deals essentially with the patterns of spread of insurgency through iconic and symbolic signs or even rumors. Other subaltern sections or groups are also contacted and drawn in the uprising. Sacred idioms are often used in arousing mass support, such as prayer meetings, beating drums, distributing sindoor or vermilion powder, etc. Lastly, territoriality is that aspect of peasant or tribal consciousness in which rebels get bound by blood ties on the one hand and by local bond on the other. A sense of belongingness to a common lineage and to a shared habitat overlap with one another. Thus, ethnic space and physical space notions are constituents of territoriality. Guha has stressed the fact that even this consciousness has often transcended the limits of ties of either blood or habitat or both. For example, the revolt of 1857. Guha's subaltern approach draws heavily on Emile Durkheim's notion of elementary forms or George Simel's concept of forms of interaction. Guha treats the lowest strata of the rural society, that is, impoverished landlords, rich and upper middle peasants, as all belonging to the category of people or subaltern classes. and focused on only those mass mobilizations which took place in the colonial period and had an insurgent character. This means that Guha has clearly distinguished between the politics of the elite class of the society and the politics of the masses, the common man, and he has studied extensively the movements that have taken place in India during the colonial period. Now, let us see the ideas or views of David Hardiman. David Hardiman used subaltern perspective in his study of a tribal movement in Western India. He observed the mass movement in South Gujarat, Panchamahal, in early 20th century by the Bhils, and it was also termed as Devi movement. It was peaceful, led by tribals themselves, spread over a large region, involved a considerable number of people, and focused on bringing social reforms among the tribals. Hardiman notices that this movement was ignored by the contemporary government, the newspapers, the nationalists and the historians. When the activities of the tribals were firmly noticed by the nationalists, they remarked that these were done under the influence of outsiders like Gandhi. Hardiman points out that the existing observers of tribal life had completely denied the tribals any initiative or decision-making capacity. Such denial of existence to the tribals is what Hardiman criticized. There were many individual and group efforts to deter Adivasis from taking liquor. These efforts were mainly made by rural elite and bhajan mandal groups of the village. But the remarkable change in the consciousness of the Adivasis came with Devi movement. The Coming of Devi by Hardiman is a work on the assertion of the tribals in Western India against the Sahukars, the moneylenders. The Devi movement started as a small ceremony among the fisher folk of the Palghar Taluka in Gujarat in late 1921. Later, it spread to other parts of Gujarat. Hardiman observed that the tribals had started social reform movement not merely to get rid of the drinking habit, but also as a rebellion against the domination of Parsi liquor vendors who had brought them into debt bondage, and also against the domination of big landlords. This Devi was supposed to have come from the mountains to the east, and she expressed her demands through the mouth of spirit mediums. The mediums sat before the crowd and pronounced the commands of Devi, such as stop drinking liquor and toddy, stop eating meat and fish, etc. When they finished, the girl who was dressed as Devi was offered coins and gifts. Later, they sat for common dinner, also known as Bhandara. The Devi movement led to political mobilization of the tribals and also raised their standard of living. However, it did not result in their total emancipation, as the domination of Parsis was replaced by a more hegemonic domination of the elite among the tribals over all others. But it did result in other kinds of benefits, such as in the region where the Devi movement spread the far more, exploitative capitalist farmer could not find roots. Hardiman's book entitled Feeding the Baniya represents an attempt to understand the nature of power that usurers have exercised over subaltern classes in rural India over several centuries. This power had strong political and cultural dimensions along with economic elements. It was very tenacious, not only surviving the transition to colonial rule but also thriving in the new environment. Even when resisted in popular revolt, usurers personified in popular imagination by the figure of the Baniya merchant seemed to have a remarkable capacity to bounce back, redefining the terms of their relationship with the subaltern to their perpetual advantage. Hardiman attempts to see how such a domain of power was forged, how over the centuries the Baniyas managed to adapt their practice so effectively within succeeding state formation, and how the classes whom they exploited related to them and also resisted them. In this detailed and comprehensive study of the relationship between peasants and Baniya in Western India, Hardiman examines how and why the Baniyas have over the centuries managed to exert their power over the peasantry. An explanation purely in terms of economics of the relationships is, however, he argues, is not adequate. Crucial also has been the support extended to the Baniya by successive states from pre-colonial to colonial times. But over and above, this is the ideological or hegemonic power that Baniyas have been able to exercise over the peasants. Applying insights derived from the works of Gramsci, Foucault, Bourdieu, Hardiman explores the nature of this hegemony, seeing how a shared set of beliefs could help the Baniyas consolidate their power. Despite this, the relationship was by no means a harmonious one. There was a whole range of tensions which at times gave rise to protests and resistance. Hardiman's work was initially conceived as a study of Baniyas in Gujarat, which has been his chief area for historical research. However, in the course of the investigation, he also included Rajasthan as it was the heartland of the Marwari Baniya group. Now, let us move on to the subaltern perspective of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. With the advent of Ambedkar into the Indian politics arena during 1920s, the issue of social reforms achieved a new dimension. He believed that until and unless the downtrodden themselves came forward and fight their battle, no one else could alleviate their grievances. Self-awakening, he thought, could provide them necessary strength to emancipate themselves. Ambedkar realized that caste and Brahminic Hinduism reinforce each other and discriminate against the weaker sections of the society. The Vedas, the Smritis, and the Shastras were all instruments of torture used by Hinduism against the untouchables. He emphasized that the Smritis and Shastras are not the embodiment of religion, but a system of rules to deprive the untouchables even of their basic needs and deny them equal status in the society. It was Ambedkar's subaltern perspective which pierced through the Shastras to reveal their true face. And another aspect of Ambedkar's subaltern approach for the emancipation of Dalits and their empowerment was his distinct formulation of Indian nationalism in opposition to the dominant discourse of Hindu nationalism as represented by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. His conception of nationalism articulated and synthesized the national perceptions and aspirations of the downtrodden. Ambedkar's alternative form of nationalism, popularly known as Dalit Bahujan Samaj, also incorporated the subaltern philosophy of Jyotiba Phule and E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar. It constructed an anti-Hindu and anti-Brahminical discourse of Indian nationalism. It aims at establishing a caste-less and a classless society where no one would be discriminated on the basis of birth and occupation. Within the Dalit Bahujan framework of Indian nationalism, Ambedkar built up a critique of pre-colonial Brahminism and its unequal social setup based on low and high dichotomy of graded caste system which promoted exploitation. Thus, Ambedkar provided a subaltern perspective to see the magnitude of caste-ridden society of India and to find the ways to guard the interests of the Dalits. The ideas of John Dewey, Edwin Seligman, the Fabians, and the British idealists had a deep impact on Ambedkar. A large part of Ambedkar's writings had a direct bearing on Hinduism, and he argued that Buddhism, which attempted to establish society on the basis of reason and morality, was a major revolution, both socially and ideologically, against the degeneration of the Aryan society. It condemned the Varna system and gave hope to the poor, the exploited, and the women. It rallied against sacrifices, priestcraft, and superstitions. The Buddhist Sangha became the platform for the movement towards empowering the common man. However, Brahminism struck back against the revolution through the counter-revolution launched by Pushyamitra. For Ambedkar, the literature which legitimated and instituted the counter-revolution was Smriti literature in general and Manusmriti in particular. It gave birth to the system of assigning human beings to social roles, reduced Shudras to servitudes, and deprived women of any status. This was the beginning of Brahminism, the principles of which were significantly different from the Varna Vyavastha of the Vedic period, which allowed wide mobility although it ordered society hierarchically. Ambedkar's understanding of caste and the caste system underwent certain significant changes over the period of his writings. Initially, he had argued that the major features of caste was endogamy. He suggested that the evils such as sati, child marriage, and prohibitions on widow remarriages were the outcome of caste. Further, if a caste closed its boundaries, other castes were also forced to follow the suit. The Brahmins, closing themselves socially, first gave rise to the system of caste. Later, Ambedkar focused on other characteristics of caste, such as the division of labor, absence of interdining, and the principle of birth, which he had earlier largely absorbed within endogamy. He also found that caste name is an important feature. Ambedkar thought that caste is an integral part of Hindu religion and it is very difficult to reform Hinduism. Ambedkar attacked the institution of untouchability and felt that untouchables must fight their own battle and those who are concerned about them must help them to fight rather than prescribing solutions to them. He discussed attempts to deny the existence of untouchables and to reduce the proportion of their population in order to deprive them of adequate political presence. He argued that in spite of differences and cleavages, all untouchables share common disadvantages and received equal treatment. He exhorted them to fight for political power. In his writings, Ambedkar discussed about primitive tribes and the tribes labeled as criminal tribes. He saw them basically as outside the pale of civilization and blamed Hinduism for confining them to such subhuman levels. In terms of deprivation, he felt the untouchables and these communities formed a common constituency. Ambedkar did recognize a myriad of other identities in India, such as subcastes, castes, groupings of castes such as touchables and untouchables, twice-born or regenerated castes, and the Shudra religious groups, regional identities, and sometimes identities resulting from mutual reinforcement of all these groups. Ambedkar acknowledged the presence of linguistic and cultural identities but argued that identity must be within the bounds of rule of law, the demands of development, justice, and participation. Thus, the ideal solution for the problem of linguistic states is not one language, one state, but one state, one language. Ambedkar also took active interest in the working class movement. He believed that the division of labor in industrial establishments was based on caste relations and pointed out that as long as the working class was fragmented into castes, their common bond would prove too fragile to wage determined struggles. Ambedkar's ideas on colonialism too are significant. He maintained that colonialism benefited the untouchables least except for the rule of law which it introduced, allowing some space for them. He insisted on a responsible and accountable government based upon adult franchise and was one of the first leaders in India to demand universal adult franchise. He felt that to sustain rights, to maintain order, and to facilitate a vibrant civil society, constitutional order expressed in the rule of law becomes imperative. Ambedkar was the first major theoretician in India who argued that consideration for the disadvantaged should be the constitutive base of the state. He developed a complex set of criteria to determine disadvantaged and attempted to specify its various gradations. Untouchability was one of the disadvantages and the most degrading one. He distinguished disadvantaged into cultural, religious, ethnic or linguistic and approached these issues separately for the adoption of appropriate policy measures. Ambedkar's significant contribution has been to develop a system of safeguards for the disadvantaged in general and the untouchables in particular, which could be enforceable, quantifiable, and accountable. It is not enough that equal resources and opportunities are assigned to these people. Therefore, the disadvantaged need to be extended certain preferences that result in giving a fair opportunity to them. Dalit is a byproduct of the Ambedkar movement and indicates political and social awareness. Ambedkar adopted a different approach and philosophy for the emancipation of scheduled castes. He wanted to liberate the Dalits by building an egalitarian social order, which he believed was not possible within the fold of Hinduism, which reinforced hierarchy and placed Dalits at the bottom. He maintained that the Dalits should come forward and assert for their own cause. He gave them a threefold mantra: educate, organize and agitate. Mahatma Jyotiba Phule's subaltern perspective we will discuss now. The Dalit Bahujan understanding of caste has its similarities with a Marxist approach. It views society as a system of contradiction and exploitation, in contrast to the dominant elite depiction of a generally harmonious society and functionalist interpretation of Varna. However, the basis of exploitation was not class, as determined by relation to the economic means of production, but caste, as historically constituted in Indian society. Bahujans or Dalits or Shudras and Atishudras in Phule's terminology were the producing sections of the society, but they were constituted historically and determined by heredity, that is, by marriage and kinship along Jati lines. The exploiting groups were the upper castes, but primarily the Brahmins in alliance with kings. For Phule, Hinduism was not a true religion. It was a creation of the Arya-Bhat Brahmins to maintain their ideological hold over the masses. He insisted that a true religion should be rationalist, based on truth, universalistic, and promoting social justice. Phule was greatly influenced by the ideas of Thomas Paine, as Paine's works presented radicalism of a very different kind. Paine opposed the dominant role of the Pope in the lives of the Catholics. He claimed that if the God is one and if he sees everyone equally, then there is no need of any mediator, that is, the Pope. Inspired by such radical thoughts, Phule also believed that there was universal equality of man and hence no Brahmin is required as a mediator in Hinduism. In 1848, Phule turned to the reform of traditional Hindu society as the most important single issue for the socially concerned. In education, he thought, lay the key to the fundamental change in social attitudes. He opened the first school for untouchable girls in Pune in 1848. Several more schools were founded in Pune in the next 4 years. Phule believed that the lower castes should be given a thorough education and not just basic skills of reading and writing, as this would give them the power to distinguish between good and bad. The Satyashodak Samaj, established by Phule, took to an increasingly extreme stand on the responsibility of Brahmins for the deprivation of low castes. It devoted a very large part of its energy to the cause of education of the lower castes. He was concerned in particular with the use of education as a vital social resource that conferred great power on Brahmin social groups. Brahmins formed by far the largest proportion of those in the new vernacular and government English schools and in the new administrative, educational, judicial and revenue institutions of the British Raj. The result was a virtual Brahmin monopoly of the strategic position of administrative intermediaries between the British government and the masses of Hindu society. This extended the traditional Brahmin authority from religious to secular. Phule drew together religious and political relationships within Western Indian society to form his own distinctive brand of clericalism. He criticized the excessive pay and pensions to the employees of the bureaucracy and also asked for reservations for Dalits and Bahujans and for reduction of bureaucracy. For example, in the forest department. He also demanded reduction in the pay scales of the higher level employees. Phule considered Hindu religion as the worldview of specifically Brahmin social groups. He accepted the Aryan theory for explanation of castes. He depicted Brahmins as the transcendents of the Aryan invaders who had conquered the indigenous people of India. They imposed caste as an instrument of social control designed to perpetuate their rule. This formed the central device in Phule's explanation of the sufferings of the lower castes. Hence, he denied the legitimacy of Brahminic religious authority and asserted the hidden Kshatriya identity of all lower castes. While Phule generally approved of the cultural and philosophical impact of British rule, his economic critique of British imperialism was as severe as any elite nationalist. He saw the peasants as severely exploited through high taxes, but the drain of the surplus went not only to England and the English, but also to the Brahmins who occupied the bulk of the bureaucracy. Phule was also aware of the degree to which the competition from British imported manufactured goods was ruining a good section of the Indian artisans. However, he forthrightly rejected the solution of Swadeshi. He saw exchange of goods and ideas between people of different countries, that is, globalization was fundamentally beneficial, and cutting off this exchange was one means that Brahmins had used historically to maintain their power. The solution that Phule offered to the problem of foreign competition was a combination of education and technology. The masses of people should be educated, with universal primary education being made compulsory and schools established with teachers drawn from the Shudras and Atishudras. And it should be technologically oriented. Children should learn both literary skills and skills related to their occupation, whether agriculture or artisan crafts. In conclusion, it can be said that subalternism has been a significant perspective that various scholars have used in the study of various tribal, peasant and anti-caste movements in India. Guha studies mass mobilization in the form of insurgencies which took place among the peasants and tribals and lacked recognition. He also created a distinction between the elite politics and the politics of the masses. Hardiman uses this approach to understand the structure of power relations in rural India. He has studied extensively the Baniyas of India and has tried to explain how the relationship between the Baniyas and the lower classes of the society are related to each other and how the relationships between them are defined by power and authority, basically economic. The anti-caste movements of the 19th century launched by Dr. Ambedkar and Mahatma Phule demanded representations for members of all castes and sections, and they offered an all-encompassing alternative to elite nationalism.